Puppy was left tied to a tree in the middle of a road. What happened next was heartbreaking. Have you ever wondered what goes through a dog's head when he realizes he's been left behind? When the only thing he knows, the smell, the voice, and the touch of those who are supposed to protect him, suddenly disappears. For such a small and fragile puppy, the world is already a scary place. But being alone, tied to a tree, in the middle of a deserted road, makes everything even worse. The wind was blowing hard, swaying the branches of the surrounding trees, causing dry leaves to swirl across the ground. The puppy, with short, light hair, was shaking not only from the cold, but from fear. His wide, innocent eyes reflected the confusion and panic growing within him. He didn't understand what had happened. The warmth of the hands that held him moments before faded to nothing. The sound of the car's engine moving away was the only thing he could hear, and with every meter the vehicle traveled, his only hope went away with it. He pulled the rope, first gently, then with more force. But it was resistant. It squeezed his little neck, and the more he tried to escape, the more he felt the pain of the tightness against his delicate skin. His heart was beating fast, as if trying to compensate for the uncertainty of what would come next. He looked in every direction, hoping that someone would appear, that this was just a mistake that would soon be fixed. But no one came. Time passed slowly. The sun was high, and the heat was beginning to punish her exposed skin. The ground beneath his paws heated up, making the discomfort even greater. His little stomach growled softly, a growing hunger that he didn't know how to satisfy. His first impulse was to cry. A thin, broken bark escaped his throat, but there was no response. Then he tried again, and again. Each bark was a cry for help, an attempt to call back that human who, for some reason he would never understand, decided to leave him there. And then there was silence. The cub realized that screaming was no use. He lowered his head and huddled next to the tree, as if he wanted to make himself smaller, invisible. Fear now shared space with exhaustion. His eyes remained fixed on the empty road, watching cars pass by in the distance without ever slowing down. Some people even looked in his direction, but no one stopped. Nobody cared. As the hours passed, his breathing became slower. Fatigue took over, but he couldn't sleep. What if the person who left you came back? What if someone finally stopped? He needed to stay awake. I needed to wait. Time followed its own merciless rhythm, and then night came. The heat gave way to a biting cold, and the cub began to shiver even more. His small body couldn't retain heat for long, and hunger was now a deep hole in his empty stomach. His nose sniffed the air, hoping to find some familiar scent, something that brought comfort. But all he smelled was the scent of the earth, the serene wet leaves and the cold asphalt. Deep inside, a distant howl echoed, causing his body to shrink even more. He didn't know what was out there, but he knew it was bigger, stronger, and faster than him. His heart was beating so hard against his chest that it felt like it would jump out. But he couldn't do anything. I couldn't run away. So he did what any puppy would do when he ran out of options. He gave in to tiredness. His eyes began to close, heavy. His breathing became irregular. Maybe if he slept, everything would be a dream. Maybe when he woke up, he would be back in that warm place where he slept curled up, smelling someone hugging him. But the night was long, so long that for a moment he thought the sun would never return. He lay there curled up, unaware that his fate was about to change, and that soon he would meet someone who would change his life forever. Puppies should never know abandonment, but this is the reality for many. If you believe that, every dog deserves love and a safe home. Comment "never abandoned" in the comments. Take advantage and subscribe to the channel for more exciting stories like this, and leave a like so more people can see it. The night passed slowly, and the sun, little by little, began to appear on the horizon, painting the sky with orange tones. But for the little cub, nothing had changed. He was still there, stuck in that lonely tree, surrounded only by the emptiness of a forgotten road. His eyes, tired and sad, observed everything around him, without understanding why he was there alone. The wind was blowing strong, stirring up dust and dry leaves that danced across the ground. Every now and then, a branch would snap in the distance, causing her fragile little body to tremble in fear. The silence was eerie, broken only by the noise of distant cars that passed too quickly for anyone to notice. The rope still tightened his neck, preventing any attempt to escape. He had already given up on pulling. Her sensitive skin was bruised from the friction, and the pain was now just another weight on her tired little body. Hunger throbbed inside him, an emptiness he couldn't understand. His stomach was growling, but there was nothing around that he could eat. He tried licking some dry leaves around him, hoping to ease the uncomfortable sensation, but all he felt was a dry, bitter taste. His eyes remained attentive, fixed on the road, waiting for someone to stop, for some outstretched hand to come and rescue him. But the road seemed indifferent to his suffering. Minutes turned into hours, and each hour was an eternity. He no longer knew how much time had passed since he was left there. The day dragged on, the sun getting higher, and the heat began to punish her fragile skin. He huddled against the tree, seeking a shadow that barely existed. His breathing became shorter, and his mouth became dry. He needed water, he needed something to alleviate that feeling of weakness. But all he found was a hard, dusty floor. Time took its relentless course, and as the day progressed, the cars passing by seemed even more distant. Some people even watched the little one being tied there, but no one stopped. Maybe they were in a hurry. Maybe they thought he belonged to someone and would come get him soon. Maybe they just didn't want to get involved. But for the puppy, each car that passed without stopping was one more blow, another hope ripped from his little heart. He didn't know the world could be so cruel. The wind blew again, this time colder. The afternoon was coming to an end, and he realized that night was coming again. His body began to shake, not only from the cold, but from the fear of what was to come. Last night was scary enough that he never wanted to go through that again. But there he was, still tied up, still alone, still waiting for something that might never come. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to find some comfort within himself. He remembered the smell of the hands that used to hold him, the warmth of a lap where for a short time he found safety. But now it all seemed as distant as the stars that would soon begin to appear in the sky. His body hurt, his mind was exhausted, his heart beat slowly, getting weaker and weaker. The road remained empty, the weather remained relentless, and he kept waiting. Time continued to pass, mercilessly. The cub no longer knew how many hours he had been there, trapped in that tree, isolated from the world. The sun had already set, and darkness was beginning to take over the scene. The shadows of the trees lengthened around him, making the environment even more frightening. Every sound of the night made her little body shudder. He no longer expected that human to come back for him. Now his only instinct was to try to survive. His body was weak, but despair spoke louder. He started pulling on the rope again, trying to free himself, first with a timid movement, then with more force. His neck felt tight and the pain increased, but he didn't give up. He tried to turn, tried to chew the rope with his small and still fragile teeth, but the material was thick, tough, too strong for her delicate jaw. He pulled again once more, but the rope tightened even more. He felt greater discomfort on his skin, as if he were being cut. He stopped for a moment, took a deep breath, looked around in search of some way out. But all he saw was darkness. The pain was intense, but the fear was even worse. He began to whimper, a thin, sad sound that echoed across the deserted road. It was her cry for help, her silent scream to anyone who could hear. But the night was big, and he was small. Her crying mixed with the sound of crickets, with the wind that whistled through the leaves. He tried again, this time barking a little louder, but there was no response. Silence was his only return. Hunger now burned within him like an urgent need. His stomach was growling, and the weakness made everything more difficult. He lowered his snout to the ground, sniffing for anything that might deceive his empty belly, but there was nothing there, just dry earth and dead leaves. He licked the floor, looking for some taste that could alleviate that unbearable emptiness, but all he felt was a bitter taste of dust. With each passing minute, hope became more distant. The cold was pressing, and his body began to lose strength. His eyes, once bright, were now heavy, tired. He tried to lie down as best he could, curling up to try and protect himself from the biting wind. Its small hairs were not enough to warm it. He was shaking, and the night seemed to have no end. But even in the midst of exhaustion, something inside him still fought. He didn't want to give up. I couldn't give up. His eyes returned to the road, to that long, empty path that could bring his salvation. All he needed was one person to stop. Just one. And so even without strength, he continued waiting. The night came like a dark cloak, covering everything around. The sky, which previously still held the last orange tones of the sunset, was now a deep pitch black, dotted only with a few shy stars that barely lit the way. The temperature dropped quickly, as if the heat of the day had never existed. The puppy felt the difference immediately. His small body, already weakened by fatigue and hunger, began to shake even more. The early morning cold slowly infiltrated his short hair, reaching his sensitive skin, making every second more difficult to bear. He huddled against the tree, trying to find some protection from the biting wind that now whistled around him. His paws were cold, his nose was wet and trembling. He pressed his body against the ground in an attempt to steal some of the earth's heat, but all he felt was an even more intense cold running up his slender legs. His body begged for shelter, for anything to protect him from that cruel night, but all he had was the solitude and immensity of the deserted road. The night had its own sound, very different from the day. During the sunlight, the road just seemed empty, silent, indifferent. But now everything seemed more alive, more threatening. The wind made the leaves rustle, a dry, uneven sound that echoed around like invisible footsteps. Dry branches cracked in the distance, breaking under the weight of something he couldn't see. The cub raised its head, its small, attentive ears trying to pick up any threat. He didn't know what could be there, hidden in the darkness, but his instinct told him to stay still so as not to attract attention. His heart skipped a beat when a distant howl broke the silence of the night. It was long, deep, filled with a strength he didn't have. The sound traveled through the frigid air, seeming even closer than it actually was. The cub shrank even more, trying to disappear into the shadows. He didn't know what that sound meant, but something inside him told him he should be afraid. His wide eyes moved quickly, trying to see through the darkness that seemed to grow thicker and thicker. One more snap, this time closer. His body stiffened. His breathing became short, almost inaudible. He knew there was something there. Something was moving between the trees, and even without seeing it, he felt it. His small chest rose and fell rapidly, as if his heart was trying to compensate for its weakness with pure survival instinct. But he couldn't run. The rope was still tight around him, tying him to that place. His body was begging to run away, but he had no choice. If something approached, he would have no way of escaping. There would be no way to fight. Fear now took over every part of him, freezing him from the inside out. The dawn advanced slowly, as if time had stopped to test its resistance. His stomach ached with hunger, his body shook non-stop. His eyes, heavy with fatigue, insisted on closing, but fear wouldn't let him. He needed to stay awake, needed to watch the darkness around him. But how? Much longer could he resist? He let out a small moan, almost a whisper, as if trying to call out to someone who would never come. Its fragile bark was nothing more than a muffled echo in the vastness of the night. The moon, high in the sky, seemed to watch him, but offered no relief. The road remained empty. The wind continued mercilessly. The night continued endlessly, and he continued to fight to survive. Time passed cruelly, dragging the hours as if it wanted to test every bit of the little cub's resistance. The night had been long and scary and cold, but somehow he was still there. His body was weak, but his heart insisted on continuing to beat. The sky began to slowly lighten, and the first rays of sunlight touched the empty road. The cub blinked his heavy eyes, trying to understand if that meant the worst part was over. But deep down, he knew that the worst part wasn't the dark of night. The worst thing was to remain alone. The wind was still blowing cold, stirring up dust and dry leaves around him. Her small body huddled further against the tree, seeking warmth that never came. His short hair wasn't enough to protect him, and every icy breeze seemed to sap even more of his energy. But there was something different that morning. The silence, which was previously absolute, began to be broken by a distant sound. An engine. He lifted his head, his watchful eyes turning to the road. His heart raced, and his instinct made him stand up, even though his paws were numb. It was a car. A sound he knew, a sound that brought back memories. The roar of the engine approached, and for an instant, something inside him lit up. Hope, the one that had been crushed so many times, tried to rise once again. The car came around the bend, coming fast. The cub stretched its body as far as the rope would allow, its eyes shining with expectation. He didn't know who was inside. He didn't know if that car was different from the others that passed by, but I needed to believe so. His tail, weak and without energy, tried to move, an attempt to demonstrate that he was still there, waiting, that he wanted to be seen. The vehicle passed him without slowing down. The wind generated by the passing car raised dust and leaves, and the cub closed its eyes for a second. When it opened again, the road was empty once again. The engine that once filled him with hope was now just an echo fading away in the distance. He stood still for a moment, trying to understand what had happened. Why didn't they stop? He didn't know that to whoever was inside that car, he was just a small figure on the side of the road. Maybe they saw it, maybe they didn't. But in the end, nothing changed. He was still there. The sun rose a little higher in the sky, and the heat began to grow. His body, which had previously shivered from the cold, now felt the discomfort of the hot asphalt beneath his paws. But it didn't matter. He still waited. His heart still insisted on believing that if one car passed, another could pass too, and maybe the next one would be different. The minutes became long, drawn out. He kept his eyes fixed on the road, alert for any movement. So, one more sound, another engine, another car, and just like before, he pushed himself up as high as he could, his small body eager for a chance. The car passed straight by. Then another came, and one more, each bringing a spark of hope, only to crush it in the next instant. Hunger started to hurt his stomach again. He sat, then lay. Down, then stood up again. I couldn't find a comfortable position because there was no comfort. Every part of his body hurt, and worse than the physical pain was the confusion. He didn't understand. He didn't understand why no one stopped, why no one looked at him. Was his existence really that invisible? Her little heart was beating slowly now. With each new dashed hope, it seemed to lose a little more of its strength. He lowered his head and placed his nose on the dry earth, closing his eyes. For a moment. Maybe if he slept, everything would be different when he woke up. Maybe the next car would be the one that would get him out of there. Or maybe no one would stop. Maybe he was destined to disappear there, on that forgotten stretch of road. But even as his thoughts became confused and his strength waned, he didn't give up. Because deep down, dogs don't give up. Even when everything says otherwise, they keep waiting. And that's what he did. Waited. Hope is a strange thing. She resists even when everything says it should end. Even after so many cars passing non-stop, after the cold of the night, the hunger that burned his little stomach and the thirst that dried his mouth, the puppy was still there, waiting. But now, something inside him was beginning to give way. His body no longer had any energy, his paws were numb, and his breathing was slow, tired. The sun was out, and the heat was relentless. The ground beneath their paws, which before was just uncomfortable, now burned. Her small body, so fragile, tried to shrink into the minimal shade that the tree offered, but it was useless. Sweat dripped down his skin under his fine hair, and his tongue lolled out of his mouth in search of relief that didn't come. The pain of hunger was no longer as strong, as his body was beginning to accept that there was no food. But the thirst, that was worse. Every breath was an effort, and he could barely swallow. He tried to bark. He tried once again to call someone, but his voice was weak, a low, hoarse sound that couldn't compare to the insistent barking from before. His own body betrayed him, denying him even the chance to ask for help. His eyes, so attentive before, began to close. It was as if each blink was a step deeper into endless tiredness. The heat was stifling, and his vision was blurry. The world around him became a blur of warm colors, the contours blending together as his head grew heavier and heavier. He didn't want to sleep. I wanted to keep waiting, but the tiredness was like an invisible weight pulling him down. Then the noise. This time it wasn't just the sound of a distant engine. It wasn't just another car passing by, ignoring its existence. This one was different. He not only appeared on the road but slowed down. Dust rose as the tires touched the ground. The sound of the engine diminished, and for the first time the silence was broken in a different way. The cub tried to lift its head, but it was difficult. His half-closed eyes caught a figure moving. A car door opened, and footsteps echoed on the dirt road. He wanted to cheer himself up. He wanted to react, to show that he was still there, but his body no longer obeyed. He tried to move his paws, but they seemed to be made of stone, too heavy for him to even be able to drag himself a little. The tail, which would once wag with joy when seeing someone approaching, remained motionless. All that was left was his gaze, now blurred, half closed by extreme fatigue. trying to focus on the silhouette that was coming towards him. Dust rose with each step of that person. The puppy noticed that she was in no hurry, that she was walking hesitantly, as if measuring each movement. There was something different there. He felt, even weakly, that he was not like the other cars that passed, nor like the figures he could barely make out on the road. His little heart, already so slowed down, pulsed a little faster. A spark of instinct ignited within him. Was it fear? Was it hope? He no longer knew. The figure stopped before him. The cub took a deep breath, pulling in the hot, dry air from the road, and his chest rose and fell with difficulty. The smell was new, different from the sense of dust and earth that had dominated his sense of smell for so long. He was human, but humans didn't mean safety. Humans left him there. Humans passed without looking back. Humans made him feel abandoned. But then came the voice, low, soft, unlike anything he had heard. Before, it wasn't a harsh sound, it didn't carry any rush, it didn't demand anything. It was a calm murmur, a thread of sound that glided through the air and reached his attentive ears. He didn't understand the words, but he felt the tone. Something warm, something that didn't hurt. The person slowly bent down, no sudden movements, no attempts to grab or force him. The cub continued to look, motionless, not knowing what to expect. His heart was now beating in a strange rhythm, confused between fear and the desperate need to believe. What if it was just another illusion? What if that approaching hand brought something worse? What if, after all, he was just dreaming? But then, a touch, so different from what he knew. There was no strength, there was no coldness, just heat. His fingertips gently slid over his dirty, fragile head. He stroked between his floppy ears, ran his thin, battered skin carefully, as if he was afraid of breaking him even more. The cub didn't move, but inside, something small and forgotten began to awaken. It was something he almost no longer recognized. It was the feeling of not being alone. And at that moment, he knew his story was about to change. The touch was warm, gentle, unlike anything the puppy had felt up until that point. For the first time, after so many hours of fear and abandonment, he didn't cower, he didn't try to run away, he didn't close his eyes waiting for the worst. He just lay there, motionless, absorbing that new, fragile, almost forgotten sensation. It was a touch that didn't bring pain. It didn't squeeze, it didn't hurt, it didn't reject. It just said, in a silent language, that maybe, just maybe, everything would be okay. The voice remained low, soft, almost a whisper in the wind. The puppy didn't understand the words, but the tone carried something that he vaguely recognized, something that his memory, although weakened, insisted on searching for. Protection. Careful. He wanted to believe it, but his body was exhausted. His small heart, which had forced itself to continue beating, now gave in to the weight of fatigue. His head, as much as he wanted to stay up, gave way, lying against the dry earth. He felt arms wrapping around his body, a heat different from the punishing sun that burned his skin. It was a welcoming warmth that brought a strange feeling of comfort. The rocking of the car was a new challenge. The noise of the engine, which previously symbolized just another vehicle passing by without, looking back, now became part of a confusing scene. The cub could barely open its eyes. His body, so fragile, so small, seemed to sink against the soft fabric where he had been placed. He felt fresh air coming from somewhere, a relief to his parched skin. The smell of the car was different from the dust and loneliness of the road. There was something there, something human, something safe. But then, the silence was replaced by another kind of noise. Unknown sounds, hurried footsteps, voices that blended together. He didn't know where he was. He tried to move, but his body didn't respond. He felt different hands now, holding him gently but also firmly. He heard something metallic clink, the muffled noise of doors opening and closing. And then, the voice that was already beginning to become familiar spoke again, but this time to someone else. He needs help. The ground where he was lying changed. Now it was something smooth and cold, different from the hot dust of the road. A new hand slid over his skin, feeling him with a technical, almost studied touch. The cub tried to open its eyes, but the brightness of the lights above it was too bright. He felt a slight tug on one of his paws, skillful fingers examining his thin body, feeling his prominent bones beneath the thin skin. "He's very weak," said a new voice, deeper, more serious. There was a sigh. Long, deep. It will be difficult, but he has a chance. Those words passed through the dense air of the room and somehow reached the cub. He didn't understand the exact meaning, but the tone carried something he recognized. It wasn't mercy. It wasn't rejection. It was a promise. The hands continued working. Something slightly pressed his skin, and he felt a little discomfort, but he didn't resist. I didn't have the strength to resist. The smell around him was unlike anything he had ever smelled before, a mix of cleaning, chemicals, and something slightly metallic. But deep down, there was another smell there. A smell that brought back a distant, almost forgotten memory. Other dogs. He was not alone. A light sting, a cold liquid entering his skin, and his small body, which was no longer responding properly, began to sag even more. The sound around him grew quieter, more distant. He felt a comfortable weight covering his body, something that was neither the freezing night wind nor the suffocating heat of the sun. It was something else, something new. He didn't know what would happen next. But for the first time, I wasn't completely alone in finding out. Darkness still enveloped him when he felt something different. It wasn't the biting cold of the night, nor the scorching heat of the sun that punished her fragile skin so much. It was a new sensation, something softer, more welcoming. The cub's small body, previously stiff with fatigue and suffering, now rested on a soft surface. He didn't know exactly where he was, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the roughness of the hard ground beneath his paws. The smell around him was also different. There was no dust, there was no dry odor of abandonment. Instead, there was a faint scent of cleanliness, mixed with something he couldn't name, but which brought a strange sense of security. He tried to open his eyes, but the light made him blink repeatedly. The light was brighter than he remembered. His eyes were heavy, his body even more so. Everything seemed to require immense effort. Then, something touched his mouth. It was a cool liquid, something that went down his dry, raw throat, bringing immediate relief. Water. He didn't know how much he needed it until he felt the liquid run through his body, calming the burning thirst that had consumed him for so long. But even with the water, the emptiness in my stomach remained, a deep, cutting hunger that was no longer just a nuisance, but part of his existence. Soon after, the smell of food came. Something pasty was carefully placed near his mouth. The cub smelled it, but for a moment he hesitated. His mind was still in a place where food meant fight, where every morsel needed to be fought for. But there, in that silent and safe space, no one tried to take it from him. He just needed to eat. With effort, he licked the food slowly. His body was so weak that chewing seemed an impossible task. But as the food went down his throat, something inside him reignited. An instinct, a remnant of survival that, even after so much suffering, still existed. The following days were a constant battle between fear and hope. The cub was getting everything he needed: food, water, warmth. But his mind, marked by abandonment, did not allow him to rest completely. He slept, but never deeply. With every louder noise, with every door that opened or footsteps that echoed in the distance, he flinched as if he expected, at any moment, to be left behind again. The nights were even more difficult. When everything was silent and he didn't see anyone around, the feeling of loneliness returned to tighten his small chest. He cried softly, as if calling for someone without knowing exactly who he was waiting for. The fear of being forgotten was still there, hidden in every beat of his heart. But time, little by little, began to act in his favor. With each meal he gained a little more strength. His paws, once shaky and fragile, began to support his weight again. He still couldn't run, but he could now take small steps, explore the space around him without fear of falling. His body, once so thin, now no longer seemed so fragile. His skin, dried out by the sun and neglect, began to recover, and his hair, once dirty and disheveled, was now clean and soft. And more important than all that, his heart also began to change. The gentle touches he feared so much were now familiar. He no longer flinched when hands approached. There was still a little distrust, a protective instinct that life taught him too soon. But over time, he began to allow himself to feel something that until then seemed impossible: security. The fight for life was not just physical. It was also the fight against the fears that still haunted him, against the memories of the lonely road, the abandonment, the pain. But every time he received affection, Every time he saw someone approach and understood that he wouldn't be hurt, something inside him strengthened. And then, for the first time since it all began, he did something that had seemed impossible days before. He wagged his tail. Not a lot, just a small movement, almost hesitant, but it was enough. Enough to show that little by little life was returning to him. Time has a strange way of healing wounds, even those that seem too deep to heal. At first, each puppy's day was a silent battle, an effort to relearn trust, to accept that pain and abandonment were now part of the past. His body was no longer so fragile, his steps were no longer so shaky, and hunger no longer consumed him as before. But there was still something inside him that seemed to hesitate, a discreet fear that made him look to the side whenever someone approached too quickly, an instinct that made him shrink at the slightest sign of uncertainty. In the first few days, even with the warmth of a soft blanket and food always available, he still slept curled up as if trying to hide, as if he needed to make himself small so as not to be noticed. His nights continued to be filled with confused dreams, shadows from the past that made him moan softly in his sleep, but every morning he woke up a little stronger, a little more energetic. Then it happened. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible movement. Whoever was watching him might not have noticed it right away, but for him it was a significant moment. As he received the caress of a gentle hand, as he felt fingers slide over his head and behind his ears, something inside him reacted. His tail, which had remained motionless for days, made a small movement. First, a slight shy tremor, almost as if testing whether it was safe to express that sensation. Then a discreet, short, hesitant shake. But it was enough. He himself seemed surprised by that involuntary gesture. It was as if his body was beginning to remember something that had been dormant for too long. That affection was not something to be feared. That human presence did not mean pain. His heart, so used to fear and loneliness, gave a little jump inside his chest. In the following days, this small gesture was repeated. Not always, but at specific times. When he saw that familiar face approaching, when he heard the soft voice that always brought him comfort, when he smelled the meals being prepared. Little by little, his tail was no longer just an occasional reflection, but a clear sign of what was happening inside him. Hope was reborn. That's how the first moments of fun came. At first, it was just a mild curiosity. He watched a toy roll across the floor, his attentive eyes following the movement but not moving. There was still a trace of doubt, as if he didn't know for sure if he could participate. But then a light touch of his paw, a cautious movement of his nose pushing the object, and there he was, interacting with the world in a way he hadn't done in a long time. The days passed, and the change in him became more and more visible. His previously hesitant steps now had more firmness. His body, previously bowed by fear, was now looser. He began to run in short stretches, exploring the space around him without so much worry. It didn't take long for him to start really playing, jumping, rolling, running from one side to the other. The sparkle in his eyes that had disappeared now began to return, like a flame that was slowly rekindling. But there was something he still didn't understand. For him, that place was safe. There was food, water, a gentle touch, voices that brought comfort. But was that forever? Would he have a real home? His heart still harbored doubts, because he had already known what it was like to be left behind. He knew what it was like to bond and then suddenly lose everything. And as much as there was affection now, a part of him still feared that everything could end. And deep down, the question he couldn't express at all hung in the air. Would anyone really love him enough to never leave him again? The cub still didn't fully understand what was happening. He knew that his life had changed since the moment he was rescued. He knew that he now received food every day, that his nights were no longer cold and lonely, that his body no longer trembled with fear and hunger. But there was something inside him that still hesitated, that still didn't know if all this was real. His mind, marked by abandonment, made him question, what if this didn't last? What if he was just another dog passing through that place? But little by little, this doubt began to disappear. The man who rescued him was always nearby. He not only took care of him, but spoke to him, looked into his eyes, offered affection in moments when the puppy least expected it. His touch was never rushed, never rough, always soft, always present. There was something different about him, something the cub began to notice over time. Fernando, as he had heard other people call him, was not just any human. He understood the puppy's silence, respected his moments of fear, and celebrated each small victory as if it were a great achievement. There were days when the puppy woke up feeling safe enough to play, to chase a toy, to explore the yard without worrying about every noise around him. But there were also days when he woke up with a fear that he couldn't even explain. It was in these moments that Fernando would just sit next to him, without demanding anything, without forcing him to interact. Just there, present, allowing the puppy to understand on its own that it was safe. And then, something happened. One morning, when the cub opened his eyes, he noticed that the world around him looked different. It wasn't a shelter, it wasn't a veterinary clinic. The smell was different, the walls, the floor, everything was new. His heart quickened for an instant. He didn't know where he was, but before panic took over, he smelled that familiar smell, Fernando's smell. The man was there, smiling at him. Kneeling in front of him, he gently passed his hand over his head, and in a calm voice, said something that the cub still didn't fully understand, but he felt. "Welcome to your new home, La." He blinked a few times, trying to absorb the meaning of those words. Your new home. Did that mean he wouldn't leave? That he wouldn't have to say goodbye? That he wouldn't have to fear the day he would be left behind again? It was then that something happened. A low, unexpected sound, but one that filled the room with emotion. His little tail moved, not hesitantly, not in fear, but with a genuine joy he didn't even know he was capable of feeling yet. Fernando laughed and, without hesitation, took him in his arms. The cub flinched for a brief moment, but then relaxed. He felt the warmth of that hug. He felt the man's chest rising and falling in a calm rhythm. For the first time, he didn't feel too small to be noticed. He didn't feel too fragile to be left. He was part of something now. The following days were full of discoveries. The puppy got a name. Fernando called him Theo, and he quickly began to recognize that sound. Whenever he heard his name, he ran to the man, not because he was afraid, but because he wanted to be close. His new house was big, full of corners to explore, with a backyard where the sun hit the soft grass, so different from the hot asphalt of the road where he had been abandoned. But there was something more, something in Fernando's eyes that the puppy didn't completely understand, but felt. It was a shadow of longing, a soft sadness that from time to time hid behind smiles. It was then that he realized. The first few days, Theo felt that there was something different in that house. It wasn't just the new smell, the unfamiliar furniture, or the corners you hadn't explored yet. It was something deeper, something invisible, but present on every wall, in every space. It was as if that place held memories that he couldn't see but he could feel. In moments of silence, when Fernando stood still, looking at some distant point, Theo realized that there was an absence there, one that was not said in words, but that was manifested in the eyes of the man who saved him. Before Theo, there was another dog, one that was no longer there, but somehow had never completely left. Its smell still remained subtle in some corners of the house, mixed with memories of a shared life. Theo didn't understand exactly what that meant, but he felt that Fernando carried something inside him, a silent longing, an emptiness that no words could fill. Fernando had lost his partner a few months ago, a friend who has been by his side for years, who walked with him on cold mornings and lay at his feet on lonely nights, a friend who knew him like no one else, who understood his mood without him having to say a word, a dog who made that house a home, who filled every space with his presence, his affection, and his unconditional loyalty. But one day he was gone, and the house, once full of life, fell into a silence that was difficult to bear. Fernando, despite being a strong man, carried this emptiness every day. At first, I didn't know how to deal with the loss, the routine that once seemed so natural, filling the food bowl in the morning, hearing paws echoing down the hallway, feeling the constant presence at your side, suddenly was replaced by an overwhelming silence. He found himself looking at the corner where his old friend used to lie, expecting to see him there, out of pure reflex. But the space remained empty, and as much as he knew that time would help ease the pain, nothing changed the fact that his heart was marked by absence, until I found Theo. When he saw that helpless cub, tied to that tree, thin, weak, and shaking, something inside him woke up. It wasn't just pity or compassion, it was something stronger, a feeling that that small being also carried a pain that he knew well. The puppy's look, full of fear and uncertainty, reflected a lot of what Fernando felt since losing his best friend. They were two beings broken by abandonment, by loss, by the absence of someone who had once been by their side and suddenly was no longer there. Two bruised hearts, marked by what they had experienced. Life didn't lead him to that puppy by chance. It was as if their paths had crossed at the exact moment they both needed it most. Theo, without understanding the world around him, without knowing what true love was, found in Fernando a second chance to discover the good side of life. Fernando, not knowing how to fill the void left by his former friend, found in Theo a new reason to smile, to feel that his house could be a home again. The cub never met the cub that was there before him. She never heard his barking echoing through the house, never laid down next to him on rainy days, never played with him in the yard. But somehow, I felt his presence in every corner, and without even knowing it, he now occupied a special space. Not to replace, because true love can never be replaced, but to continue, to transform that house, which was once full of joy, and then plunged into silence, into a home again. And in the end, what seemed like just a rescue became something much bigger. Fernando saved Theo, but Theo also saved Fernando, and together they began a new story, where pain was in the past and love became infinite. The silence in that house was no longer the same. Before, it was heavy, full of absence, a constant echo of the loss that Fernando carried in his chest. Now it was different. The sound of Theo's paws on the floor, the rustle of the blanket as he settled down to sleep, the little sighs as he dreamed, all of this filled the spaces that had previously seemed empty. It was as if the house, little by little, began to breathe again, to have life, to become, once again, a home. But for every Theo who finds a happy ending, how many others are still waiting? How many are still stranded on deserted roads, lying in the cold, not understanding why they were left behind? How many are hungry, afraid, in pain, and won't be lucky enough to be found by someone who really cares? Abandonment is not a mistake, it is not an accident. It is a cruel choice that condemns a living being to loneliness. And the most painful thing is that dogs would never do the same. No matter what happens, they always stay. Even when they are sick, even when they have nothing to eat, even when the world becomes a difficult place, they remain faithful. They wait, even though they don't know if there is anything to wait for. They trust, even when everything tells them they shouldn't. Theo was abandoned, tied to a tree in the middle of nowhere, left behind as if his life had no value. But he was lucky. Lucky to be found, lucky to be saved, lucky to have someone who decided, at that moment, to change your destiny forever. But what about the others? Abandonment is a brutal reality that happens every day. Dogs and cats are discarded as if they were objects, thrown onto busy streets, left in vacant lots, left at the doors of overcrowded shelters. Some are puppies, like Theo, who barely had time to see the world before being rejected. Others are elderly, who spent their entire lives with a family only to be exchanged for convenience. But the fate of these animals does not need to be written by abandonment. He can be transformed by love. Fernando could have continued on that road. I could have ignored that small, shaking body. It could have been just another car that passed without looking back. But he stopped. He looked. He decided that this cub's life mattered. And because of that, Theo got a second chance. Helping an abandoned animal doesn't just mean rescuing. It means acting. It means speaking for those who have no voice. It means reporting abuse, supporting shelters, offering temporary homes, neutering, adopting responsibly. It means understanding that an animal is not an object. It is not a toy that can be left aside when it is no longer convenient. If every person who passed by an abandoned dog did something for it, the fate of many could be different. Theo suffered, but he was lucky. And how many others won't? Let this story be a reminder that every life matters, and that, for an abandoned animal, you can be the difference between fear and love, between pain and healing, between loneliness and a home. Abandonment is not an option, but helping will always be. Stories like this make us see the world with different eyes, don't they? Theo found a home, but so many others are still waiting for that chance. Now, you can be part of it too. Leave your like and subscribe to the channel so that more people know this story, and comment, "Every dog deserves love" down here. And if you found this story exciting, wait until you see what comes next. The next video is now on your screen, and I guarantee you won't want to miss it. Press now and continue this journey of love, courage, and loyalty.